early fall-suited night work. The air stayed cool without turning brittle, and the river carried a steady, low sound that made long hours feel shorter. My shift began late, after most places had closed, when routines narrowed to maintenance and documentation. I worked alone, walking exterior routes after midnight, moving from facility to facility with a clipboard and a radio. The town sat low beside the water, orderly and compact, its streets clean, its buildings intact. Nothing felt abandoned. I liked the darkness. It reduced distraction and glare, made the work efficient. At 11:40 p.m., I started my usual rounds along Riverside Drive, boots steady on the pavement, the river somewhere off to my left, unseen but present. If you want to hear more realistic accounts like this, you can subscribe quietly and follow along. I had been contracted for night shift maintenance verification, a temporary assignment covering municipal facilities after hours. My responsibility was simple: confirm exterior infrastructure, log outages, and flag anything requiring follow-up. The town's records were outdated, which slowed things down. Maps didn't always match the streets, and some checklists were clearly recycled from prior years. The clipboard I carried was dated 3 years out of cycle, corners soft from reuse. It was a mild inconvenience, nothing more. What caught my attention was the energy usage data. Night consumption was unusually low for a town this size. Not alarming, just curious. I made a note to pay closer attention as I worked, listening to radio static between check-ins while paper maps rasped lightly in the wind. The first irregularity was easy to dismiss. Streetlights were present along every route, evenly spaced, but they were all off. There were no posted outage notices, no cones or hazard markers. Houses showed signs of life, television glow, kitchen lights, but no exterior illumination. Porch lights stayed dim and contained, never spilling into the street. I counted the lamp poles as I walked, spaced every 40 yards, each one dark. It read as a cost-saving measure or an automated system keyed to traffic. I logged nothing. At that stage, there was no reason to. Over the next few nights, the pattern held. Repeated routes confirmed it wasn't a coincidence. Intersections stayed dark even during scheduled system tests. According to my checklist, at least some fixtures should have cycled briefly. None did. What changed was how the town moved. I began noticing brief, narrow flashes of light, handheld, purposeful, people crossing short distances between buildings. The lights snapped off as soon as doors closed. No one lingered. No one crossed open pavement. My footsteps echoed farther than expected in the open darkness, and I became aware of how often routes cleared just ahead of me. By the third consecutive night logged as no faults found, isolation felt less circumstantial. It felt planned. If you appreciate slow burn, realistic horror, a quiet like here helps it continue. The realization arrived without drama. I noticed that no one ever stood under the streetlights. Not once. Even where poles marked intersections clearly, the space beneath them stayed empty. I found myself slowing before crossings, my body hesitating before my mind formed a reason. At Mill Street and Wharf Road, cool air pressed against exposed skin as I paused, weighing the checklist against an unspoken caution. There was no proof of anything wrong, just an awareness that felt borrowed, like a habit learned elsewhere and remembered too late. The incident happened at 2:17 a.m. during a late route near the river bend. I heard movement ahead, multiple steps, paced, not hurried. At the same moment, lights in several nearby houses dimmed together, as if someone had turned a dial. I stepped into the intersection, my reflective vest catching nothing, and felt proximity without contact. The space seemed occupied in a way I couldn't map. The river noise dropped out, replaced by a sudden silence, as though sound were absorbed rather than stopped. I didn't see anyone. I didn't call out. I retreated the way I'd come, slow and controlled, keeping to the faint spill of light from a building behind me. As I withdrew, movement dispersed. Not ran, simply dissolved. When I reached the lit edge again, the silence lifted, the river returned, and the houses stayed dark. I stood beside my truck and wrote nothing. There was no language for what I'd experienced that wouldn't sound speculative. Instead, I adjusted my routes to stay close to buildings and finished the remaining checks mechanically. I double-checked my equipment, confirmed radio logs, and listened to the engine idle, its hum steady and grounding. The fuel gauge sat just under half during the pause. I told myself it was fatigue, coincidence layered on expectation. By the end of the shift, that explanation felt thin, but it was functional. I used it. Later, in daylight, details surfaced. Municipal memos referenced preferred dark hours, buried in neutral language. Streetlight maintenance budgets were untouched, invoices stamped, deferred, operational. No resident had ever requested lighting repairs. Walking the town by day, I saw intact fixtures, clean lenses, wiring in place. The infrastructure supported illumination that was simply never used. In hindsight, the patterns aligned too neatly to be accidental. The town hadn't failed to light its streets. It had decided not to. I finished the contract early without offering a reason. Since then, I avoid unlit intersections, even in places I know well. No reports were ever filed about that town, at least none tied to my name. What stays with me is the sense that the darkness there wasn't empty. It felt occupied, observed, and mutually understood. On my last night, logged at 3 a.m., the lights were still off, and the river moved beside me unseen. If you know someone who appreciates grounded, realistic horror, share this with them, and subscribe to hear the next account. Late winter nights suit me. I work overnight environmental compliance checks, mostly along waterways where activity slows after dark. This river town was maintained and functional. Plowed roads, intact railings, no boarded windows. The cold carried the smell of river silt and old metal, familiar and grounding. At 12:10 a.m., the thermometer on my truck read -2 degrees Celsius. Night work like this is routine for me. Walk, log, verify, move on. Darkness has never felt threatening. It simplifies the environment, strips it down to what matters. I trust patterns more than impressions, and the town, at first, presented nothing irregular. If you want to follow more accounts like this, you can subscribe for additional realistic horror experiences. My assignment was to log shoreline infrastructure after hours, flood markers, access ladders, retaining walls, things that go unnoticed until they fail. According to the documentation, streetlights in Sector C, East Bank were active and automated. In practice, they were dark. The mismatch irritated me more than it concerned me. Data often lags reality in small municipalities. I assumed delayed repairs or budget prioritization. My tablet screen became the only light source as I walked. Its glow reflected faintly off the river wall. I noted discrepancies, flagged them for later review, and continued. At that point, the darkness was still an administrative problem, not an environmental one. When I manually tested the lighting system, the streetlights responded. Each pole activated cleanly, no flicker, no fault codes, then shut off again. Every time, the duration was identical, 14 seconds. The brief artificial light was swallowed by darkness as if it had never been there. Nearby homes stayed dim but occupied. Curtains shifted, televisions glowed. Nothing suggested a malfunction. After the third identical response, I stopped testing. Repeated false flags complicate reports, and there was no evidence of failure, only compliance that ended too quickly. Over the next several nights, I repeated the same checks across town. 5 separate poles reacted the same way, each test producing light and then immediate darkness. I began to notice how people behaved during those moments. When the lights came on, movement paused. Figures stopped mid-step, doors stayed closed. Once the lights shut off, movement resumed, quiet, efficient, brief. Footsteps retreated into side streets, muted by snow and distance. My presence started to feel disruptive, like an interruption rather than an inspection. I logged the results neutrally, noting consistency. The town itself never changed, but my role within it began to feel less passive. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror, a like here fits naturally. The realization didn't arrive all at once. I understood gradually that the lighting wasn't broken. It was being overridden. Someone, or something procedural, expected the streets to stay dark. At 2:41 a.m., I marked a test time and then left it blank. My hand hovered above the tablet, fingers stiff with cold, hesitating before triggering another cycle. The hesitation felt learned, not chosen, as if I were following a rule I hadn't been taught directly. I stood there longer than necessary, aware that continuing would change something I didn't yet understand. The incident happened while I was logging data automatically, moving through menus without looking up. I triggered the lights unintentionally. This time, the response was immediate and broader than before. Multiple buildings along the riverfront went dark at once, interior lights extinguished in sequence. Near the river wall, I heard rapid movement, several sets of footsteps coordinated close. The darkness settled back unnaturally fast, denser than before. I didn't wait for confirmation. I accessed the emergency override and shut the system down early. The code was accepted on first entry. I retreated the way I'd come, steady and deliberate, keeping my tablet angled low. Nothing followed me. No sound trailed my steps. But nothing resumed either. The town remained dark, holding its breath until I reached the edge of my inspection zone. After that, I completed only the essential logs. I left remaining areas unchecked, telling myself I'd misunderstood local norms. Daylight revealed empty, silent streets that looked ordinary enough. I finished the contract without incident, submitted my final report at 9:06 a.m., and didn't mention the override. Rational explanations are easy to assemble when nothing overt has happened. I relied on them heavily during that last morning, packing my equipment with care, as if precision alone could settle the unease. Weeks later, reviewing zoning documents for an unrelated job, I noticed lighting curfews buried in neutral language. No enforcement body was listed. No complaints had ever been filed. The clause was titled Visibility Accommodation, printed on pages that smelled faintly of damp storage. It wasn't a failure of infrastructure. It was a choice. The town had structured itself around darkness, codified it quietly, and moved on. The realization came too late to clarify anything, only to reframe what I'd already seen. I still stopped before lit streets at night, even now. Darkness there felt coordinated, intentional. I don't believe it was for safety, and I don't know who it was for. What stays with me is the memory of light switching off without delay, of compliance that required no force. My tablet battery read 87% when I left, never drained, never strained. If you know someone who appreciates grounded horror, share this with them and subscribe for the next account. Early summer nights are my preference for fieldwork. I handle overnight water quality monitoring, mostly in river towns where activity drops off cleanly after dark. This place was calm, clean, lightly populated. No shuttered buildings, no obvious decline. Insects hummed steadily near the riverbank, a sound that blended into the work rather than distracting from it. Sampling began nightly at 11 p.m., and I liked the predictability of it. Solitary night shifts suit me. They reduce interruptions and sharpen focus. Nothing here felt wrong or tense. The town rested the way small towns often do, conserving energy, letting the river carry the night. I moved through it without expectation, confident in routine and method. If you want to hear more realistic accounts like this, you can subscribe quietly and follow along. I was responsible for tracking contamination variants along the river, collecting samples from fixed points and logging temperature, turbidity, and chemical balance. The work required crossing the town on foot between sites, carrying a headlamp and an equipment case. Streetlights were listed on the map, but irrelevant to my task. I didn't think about them at all. My headlamp cut narrow cones of light ahead of me, enough to read markers and watch my footing. 3 monitoring wells sat along Dock Street, evenly spaced, easy to reach. I followed the same path each night, trusting consistency more than visibility. It took several nights before I noticed that my headlamp was always the only light in use. Streetlights never activated, even at intersections. There were no signs of outages, no repair vehicles, no taped notices. Lamp posts stood intact, numbered sequentially, their fixtures clean. Darkness remained uninterrupted by sodium glow. I assumed automation, timers keyed to traffic levels, or a scheduling decision made above my pay grade. It wasn't my system to question. I logged my samples and moved on, the river sound steady beside me. Over weeks, the pattern never changed. 14 consecutive nights logged, identical conditions. What did change was my awareness of how the town behaved after dark. Locals avoided being seen outdoors. Doors closed softly as I passed, just ahead of my light. No one questioned my headlamp or asked what I was doing. It was as if visibility itself was something to minimize. The town felt selectively invisible, choosing when and where to exist. I noticed it during longer walks, when the only movement came from me. The streets were there, wide and maintained, but unused. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror, a like here fits naturally. The realization came gradually. I noticed paths worn only between buildings, packed dirt, flattened grass, while sidewalks remained untouched. There was no foot traffic through open streets. Gravel crunch stopped abruptly at curb edges, as if people stepped off before crossing. Behind the bait shop, an alley showed clear use, while the street beside it stayed pristine. Streets existed, but they weren't used. The pattern felt practiced, not accidental. Not avoidance born of fear, but of habit. One night, at 1:33 a.m., I stepped off my routine path. The air was still windless. I crossed where I normally wouldn't, cutting diagonally across an open stretch instead of moving between buildings. My headlamp caught motion near the edge of its beam, something that froze instantly. I stopped. Nothing moved. The stillness pressed against my ears, heavy enough to register. I didn't scan or sweep the light. I didn't call out. I stood there long enough to be certain it wasn't my imagination, then backed away slowly. My heart stayed steady, alert but controlled. I kept the beam low, retraced my steps, and didn't look again. Whatever I'd interrupted didn't pursue me. It didn't need to. The darkness closed back into itself, and the river resumed its sound as if nothing had happened. After that, my routes changed without conscious decision. I finished sampling closer to buildings, keeping to the worn paths. Nothing else happened. The town remained quiet and dark. Each night, my equipment case clicked shut louder than it should have. Sample bottle number 22 stayed unused in its slot, a gap I didn't bother to explain. I completed the work, met my quotas, and avoided the open streets. It felt less like caution and more like courtesy. Later, reviewing maps for a separate report, I noticed unused sidewalks terminating short of crossings. Infrastructure supported avoidance. Streets hadn't been neglected, they'd been bypassed. Architectural lines led nowhere, curving away from open space. Design reflected behavior, not the other way around. The town had grown around a shared understanding I'd stepped into briefly, and then stepped out of again. I don't walk empty streets anymore. I trust spaces people choose not to occupy. Darkness there wasn't empty. It was respected. I still picture the river reflecting nothing at night, absorbing light without returning it. Streetlights remain listed as operational on the books, unchanged. If you know someone who appreciates grounded horror, share this with them, and subscribe to hear the next account.